The stagehand's hands were shaking as he held the small velvet box. It was October 14th, 1976, 11:52 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank. Johnny Carson was already 3 questions into what was supposed to be an ordinary conversation about John Wayne's newest picture. Nobody in that studio, not the producers, not the audience, not even Ed McMahon, had any idea that in the pocket of Wayne's jacket sat something he had carried, unopened to the public, for 39 years. Coming up, the object John Wayne pulled from his jacket that made Johnny Carson go completely silent, the promise Wayne had made to a dying man in 1937, and the real reason America's toughest cowboy had spent 5 decades refusing to talk about his own father. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way you're part of our history and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what John Wayne was about to reveal on live television would change how an entire country understood the man behind the legend. Marion Robert Morrison was 7 years old when his family moved from Iowa to the Mojave Desert town of Lancaster, California, in 1911, chasing a piece of desert land that his father, Clyde Morrison, believed would make the family's fortune, growing corn in soil that had never once in the entire recorded history of that valley produced anything worth harvesting. Clyde Morrison was, by every account given by people who knew the family, a gentle, soft-spoken pharmacist who had left a stable job in Iowa because he believed, with a specific and unshakable optimism that his son would later describe as both the most admirable and the most devastating quality a man could possess, that the desert would reward hard work and good faith. It did not. The corn failed. The land, dry and unforgiving, produced nothing but disappointment, year after year, while young Marion watched his father wake before dawn to work land that gave nothing back, and watched his mother, a sharp-tongued and increasingly bitter woman named Mary Brown, grow more resentful with each failed season, blaming her husband, openly and often in front of the children, for a mistake that was slowly destroying the family. By the time Marion was 9 years old, the family had lost the farm entirely and moved into the town of Glendale, where Clyde took work as a pharmacist again, a quieter defeat that Marion never forgot. He watched his father, a man who had once believed he could build something extraordinary from nothing, come home every evening looking smaller than he had the year before. He watched his parents' marriage disintegrate, not through any single dramatic betrayal, but through the slow, grinding erosion of two people who had wanted different things from life and had run out of ways to forgive each other for it. There is a specific memory Wayne carried from this period that he apparently described in fragments to exactly one confidant late in his life, a memory of standing in the doorway of the family's small Glendale house at age 11, listening to his parents argue in the kitchen, his mother's voice sharp and accusing, his father's voice quiet and defeated, offering no real defense, simply absorbing each accusation the way a man absorbs whether he has decided he no longer has the strength to fight. Marion had wanted in that moment to walk into the kitchen and defend his father, to say something that would make his mother stop, but he had done nothing, standing frozen in the doorway, and he later said that this specific memory, the shame of having done nothing to protect a man who could not protect himself, followed him for the rest of his life in ways he did not fully understand until he was much older. Clyde Morrison, for his part, never spoke ill of his wife in front of the children, never explained or excused his own failures, simply absorbed the slow, accumulating weight of a marriage and a life that had not gone the way he had once believed it would. And young Marion, watching this, drew a conclusion that would shape the next 50 years of his life with a force he could not have possibly anticipated as an 11-year-old boy standing in a doorway. He decided that his father's gentleness, the very quality that made him easy to love, was also the quality that had made it possible for the world and for his own wife to grind him down without consequence. He decided, somewhere in that unspoken childhood logic that shapes so much of who a person eventually becomes, that if he was ever going to avoid his father's fate, he would need to become something his father had never managed to be: hard, unbending. A man the world could not wear down, because there would be nothing soft left in him for the world to find purchase on. What almost nobody in America knew in 1976, sitting in front of their television sets watching the most famous cowboy in the history of American cinema, was that John Wayne had spent nearly 50 years constructing a public persona that was, in almost every meaningful way, the precise opposite of the father he had watched fail. Where Clyde Morrison had been gentle, John Wayne was hard. Where Clyde Morrison had dreamed and lost, John Wayne conquered, on screen after screen, decade after decade, until the image of unshakable American masculinity became so completely fused with his identity that the man underneath it, the frightened boy who had watched his father come home defeated night after night, had almost entirely disappeared from public memory. Wayne rarely discussed his father in interviews. When journalists asked about his childhood, he offered brief, practiced answers about the desert and the move to California, carefully avoiding anything that might reveal the specific grief he still carried about a man whose life, by any conventional measure, had been a story of failure and disappointment. What Wayne never discussed, not once in nearly 50 years of public life, was the last conversation he ever had with his father. A conversation that took place in a hospital room in 1937, and a promise he made that day that he had never told a single living soul he had broken. Clyde Morrison died on March 4, 1937, of heart disease, at the age of 54, in a hospital room in Glendale, California, with his 29-year-old son sitting beside the bed. Wayne was, by 1937, already a working actor, several years into a film career that had not yet produced the singular stardom that would eventually make him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, but that had already pulled him fully into a professional life his father barely understood and rarely discussed. The final hospital stay lasted 11 days, and according to the one confidant Wayne eventually spoke to about this period late in his life, Wayne visited every single afternoon, sitting beside a bed in a small shared ward, watching a man who had once seemed enormous to him as a child shrink into something fragile and diminished. Clyde Morrison spoke very little during most of those visits, exhausted by his illness and by a lifetime of disappointments he had never fully found the words to discuss even at the healthiest points of his life. But on the final afternoon, sensing perhaps with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives at the very end, he found unexpected strength to say what he needed to say. According to an account that Wayne gave, in fragments, to exactly one person over the following decades, his father, in the final hour of his life, took his son's hand and told him something that Wayne carried, in complete privacy, for the rest of his own life. Clyde told him that he was not afraid of dying, but he was afraid of what he was leaving behind, a family that had watched him fail, a son who had grown up believing that gentleness and big dreaming were the same thing as weakness. He asked his son for one thing. He asked him to promise that he would never let the world make him ashamed of being soft-hearted, that toughness and tenderness were not opposites, and that whatever Wayne became in his life, he would find a way to let people see both sides of him, not just the hard exterior the world seemed to reward. Clyde Morrison then took the pocket watch from where it rested on the small table beside his hospital bed, a watch his own father had given him decades earlier, and pressed it into his son's palm, closing Marion's fingers around it with hands that had already begun to lose their strength. He told him that he wanted him to carry it, not as a reminder of failure, but as a reminder that a man could dream big and lose everything and still be worth loving completely. That the two things were not, despite everything the family had lived through, mutually exclusive. He died less than 4 hours later. Wayne was not in the room when it happened. He had stepped out briefly to speak with a nurse, and he later said that the specific guilt of not being present for his father's actual final moment compounded, in ways he could never fully untangle, with everything else he already carried about the kind of son he believed he had been. Wayne promised his father that he would. And then, according to what he eventually revealed, he spent the next 39 years breaking that promise almost completely, building an entire career and an entire public identity around exactly the hardness his father had begged him not to hide behind, because it was easier, because Hollywood rewarded it, And because Wayne had come to believe, somewhere in the accumulating years of stardom, that his father's gentleness was the thing that had actually destroyed their family, and that hardness was the only reliable form of protection against a world that would otherwise chew a man apart the way it had chewed apart Clyde Morrison. The specific irony of what Wayne built in the years following his father's death deserves careful attention, because it explains why the moment on Carson's stage carried such enormous weight decades later. The persona that made John Wayne one of the most recognizable men on the planet, the granite jaw, the unhurried authority, the specific quality of a man who never once appeared uncertain or afraid on screen, was constructed with a precision and a consistency that went far beyond ordinary acting craft. Directors who worked with him across 5 decades noted that Wayne rarely, if ever, allowed a character he played to show genuine vulnerability without immediately following it with a gesture or a line that reasserted control, a pattern so consistent across hundreds of films that several film historians have since identified it as one of the defining structural elements of the entire John Wayne screen persona. What almost none of those historians understood, because Wayne himself never explained it in any interview during his lifetime, was that this pattern was not simply a commercially successful acting choice. It was a promise being broken in real time. Across an entire career, a son deliberately building the opposite of the father he had watched fail take after take, film after film for nearly 40 years, until the performance had become so complete that even Wayne himself, according to what he eventually admitted, sometimes struggled to locate where the performance ended and the actual man began. He married 3 times during these decades, and all 3 marriages ended in divorce, a pattern that Wayne, in later reflection, connected directly to the same inability to show softness that had defined his professional persona. He raised 7 children across those marriages, and several of them later described a father who was generous and present in practical ways, providing for them completely, showing up for the events that mattered, but who found it almost impossible to discuss feelings directly, offering love primarily through provision and protection rather than through the kind of open emotional vulnerability his own father had once begged him never to abandon. He carried this private guilt for nearly 4 decades, discussing it with almost nobody, until a single object kept in a drawer in his home for 39 years finally made its way into his jacket pocket on the afternoon of October 14, 1976. Johnny Carson had booked John Wayne for that evening's broadcast for entirely ordinary reasons: a new film to promote, a reliable and beloved guest whose appearances consistently drew some of the largest audiences the program produced. Wayne arrived at NBC Studios that afternoon in reasonably good spirits, according to the production staff who greeted him, though one longtime member of the crew later recalled that Wayne seemed unusually quiet during the pre-show preparations, a specific stillness that the crew member, having worked with Wayne on several previous appearances, found notable enough to mention to a colleague backstage. What nobody knew was that Wayne had, 3 days earlier, received a phone call from his eldest son, Michael, informing him that the old family home in Glendale, long since sold out of the family, was being demolished to make way for new development. Wayne had gone, alone, without informing his staff or his family, to stand outside that house the day before the broadcast. According to a groundskeeper who was present at the site and who recognized Wayne immediately, the actor stood on the sidewalk across the street for nearly 40 minutes, saying nothing, simply watching demolition equipment being positioned around the structure, his hands in his pockets, his famous face unreadable to the handful of construction workers who noticed him but were too intimidated by his stature to approach. The groundskeeper said that at one point, Wayne walked slowly across the street and stood at the edge of what had once been the small front yard, looking up at a second-story window that the groundskeeper later learned, from Wayne himself in a brief exchange, had been the window of the bedroom where Clyde Morrison had spent his final months before his health finally failed him completely. Wayne did not go inside. The house was already partially cleared of its interior fixtures in preparation for demolition, and access was restricted for safety reasons, but he stood at that fence for the better part of an hour, and when he finally turned to leave, the groundskeeper said his eyes were wet. Though Wayne, in the specific way that had defined his entire public existence, gave no other outward sign of what the visit had cost him, he drove home alone. He told no one, not even his own family, where he had been that afternoon, and had felt something break open in him that he had kept carefully sealed for 39 years. The broadcast began normally. Wayne discussed his new film with the easy, practiced charm that decades of interviews had made second nature to him, and Carson, sensing nothing unusual, guided the conversation through its expected territory: questions about the production, questions about Wayne's remarkable and enduring career, the kind of warm, familiar exchange that had characterized nearly every one of Wayne's previous appearances on that stage. Roughly 11 minutes into the segment, Carson asked, with entirely innocent curiosity, whether Wayne ever thought about the early years, before the fame, before any of it, and whether there was anyone from those years he wished could see what he had become. Wayne was quiet for a moment, and several people present later said that the quality of that silence felt different from Wayne's ordinary thoughtful pauses, heavier somehow, carrying a weight the studio audience could feel without understanding its source. Then Wayne reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, worn velvet box. He held it for a moment without opening it, and the studio, sensing that something had shifted in the texture of the conversation, grew unusually quiet. Wayne opened the box. Inside was a simple pocket watch, its case scratched and worn from decades of handling, a watch that had belonged to Clyde Morrison, the only object Wayne had kept from his father's meager estate, the same watch his father had been holding in his hospital bed on the last day of his life. Wayne held it out, not toward Carson exactly, but toward the camera, toward the audience, toward the country that had spent nearly 5 decades believing they knew everything worth knowing about John Wayne. He told them about his father then, for the first time in public, in nearly 50 years. He told them about the failed farm in the Mojave Desert, about watching a gentle man come home defeated night after night, about the specific and devastating way a child can watch his parents' marriage dissolve and draw exactly the wrong lesson from it. He told them about the hospital room in 1937, about his father's hand closing around his, about the promise he had made and the way he had spent nearly 4 decades building a career specifically designed to bury that promise under the hardest, most unyielding version of American masculinity the film industry had ever produced. His voice, according to everyone present, carried none of the practiced ease of his earlier answers. It was raw in a way that millions of viewers had never once heard from him, not in any film, not in any previous interview. The voice of a 70-year-old man finally setting down something he had carried since he was 29. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold, did something that revealed exactly why Wayne had chosen that stage of all the stages available to him, to finally say these things aloud. Carson did not rush to fill the silence. He did not redirect towards safer, more comfortable territory. He simply asked, quietly, whether Wayne believed his father would be proud of the man he had become. Wayne looked at the watch in his hands for a long moment. Then he said that he honestly did not know, that he had spent so many years building a version of himself that was the opposite of his father, that he had lost track, somewhere along the way, of whether any part of the man his father had actually asked him to become still existed underneath everything Hollywood had built. He said that watching his childhood home torn down the day before had made him understand, with a clarity that frightened him, that he was running out of time to figure out the answer, the same way his father had once told him he was running out of time to say the things that actually mattered. The studio audience sat in a silence that several people present described, in interviews given years later, as the most complete silence they ever witnessed at a live television taping. 300 people watching one of the most recognizable men in the world quietly dismantle, in front of them, the exact persona that had made him famous. When Wayne finally looked up from the watch, his eyes were wet, though he did not, in the specific way that had defined his entire public life, allow himself to fully break down. He said that he wanted his children and their children and anyone else watching who had ever felt that gentleness was a weakness worth hiding, to know that his father had been right, that toughness and tenderness were never actually opposites, and that he had wasted nearly 40 years believing otherwise. The studio audience's reaction to this entire sequence deserves fuller documentation, because it reveals how genuinely unprecedented this moment felt to everyone present. Several audience members interviewed by local press in the days following the broadcast described a specific and unusual quality to the silence that had filled the studio, unlike the silence that typically follows a joke that fails to land or a technical malfunction that interrupts a broadcast. One audience member, a rancher who had driven 3 hours from Bakersfield specifically to see Wayne in person, told a reporter afterward that he had grown up idolizing the exact persona Wayne was now describing as a performance, and that watching that persona crack open in real time had been one of the most disorienting and ultimately moving experiences he had ever had watching television. Ed McMahon, seated beside Carson throughout the exchange, later said in a private conversation that he had worked beside Carson for over a decade by that point and had witnessed a great many memorable guests, but that watching John Wayne's hands tremble slightly as he held his father's watch was a moment he never fully stopped thinking about for the remainder of his own career. The broadcast ran well over its scheduled time that night, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become, by any measure, one of the most unexpectedly intimate moments in the program's history. Wayne closed the segment by placing the watch back in his jacket pocket close to his chest and telling Carson, quietly, that he intended to give it to his own son that same week, along with the story that had always come with it, a story he had kept from his children for their entire lives out of the same fear that had kept him from telling it to anyone. The days immediately following that broadcast revealed something about the genuine impact of what had happened on that stage, evidence that this was not simply a moving television moment that faded from public memory within days. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an unusually high volume of calls and letters throughout the following week, many of them from men specifically, writing or calling to say that they had never before heard anyone as famous and as identified with traditional masculinity as John Wayne speak so openly about the specific cost of never allowing himself to be gentle. Several letters, preserved in archives related to the broadcast, came from fathers who wrote that watching Wayne hold his own father's watch and speak with such open emotion had prompted them to call their own adult children that same week, conversations they had been avoiding for years out of the same fear Wayne had just described on national television. One letter, from a man in Ohio, said simply that he had watched the broadcast with his 26-year-old son, both of them sitting in silence afterward, and that his son had eventually said, quietly, that he wished his own father could talk to him the way Wayne had just talked to an entire country of strangers. The man wrote that this comment had stayed with him for days and that he had finally called his son, for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, simply to tell him that he loved him. Wayne kept his promise from that broadcast. According to his son Michael, in an interview given years after his father's death, John Wayne did give him the watch that same week, along with the full story of Clyde Morrison, a story Michael said he had never once heard in its complete form until that week in October of 1976. Michael described his father sitting him down privately, away from cameras and away from the rest of the family, and speaking about his grandfather with a specific openness that Michael said he had never witnessed from his father before or after that conversation, as though something that had been sealed for nearly 40 years had finally, permanently been allowed to breathe. John Wayne passed away on June 11, 1979, less than 3 years after that broadcast, following a long battle with stomach cancer that he faced, by every account from those closest to him during his final illness, with a specific and newly discovered willingness to let his family see him afraid, see him in pain, see him as something other than the unbreakable figure he had spent 5 decades constructing for the world. Among the personal effects found in his home after his death was a small velvet box, and inside it a folded piece of paper in Wayne's own handwriting, dated the week following that Tonight Show appearance, a brief letter addressed to his children explaining the watch, explaining his father, explaining, finally and completely, the promise he had spent most of his life failing to keep, and had spent his final years trying, in whatever ways still remained available to him, to honor. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Wayne's life back to the promise he made his father in that hospital room in 1937. In the years following Wayne's own death, his son Michael occasionally spoke publicly about that pocket watch which he kept, and eventually passed to his own children along with the complete story his father had finally told him during that week in October of 1976. Michael said that his father had told him something else during that private conversation, something Wayne had apparently decided not to share on Carson's stage, saving it instead for his own family alone. Wayne had told his son that the greatest regret of his entire life was not the 3 failed marriages, not the years of emotional distance from his children during his most demanding professional decades, but the specific 39 years he had spent believing his father's gentleness had been a mistake, when in fact Wayne had come to understand only in his own final years it had been the single most courageous thing he had ever witnessed another human being do, to keep dreaming, keep hoping, keep trying, even after the world had shown him repeatedly that those dreams were not going to be rewarded. Wayne said he wished he had understood, decades earlier, that his father had not failed by remaining gentle. He had succeeded at something considerably harder than the toughness his son spent a lifetime performing. He had stayed exactly who he was, all the way to the end, regardless of what it cost him. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the people in your own life who taught you something important, long ago, that you have spent years quietly ignoring because the world seemed to reward the opposite. You do not need 39 years and a television camera to finally listen to what they told you. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that gentleness was never actually a weakness. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when legends stopped performing and started being honest. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about the promise in your own life that you're still figuring out how to keep.